Let's turn to God's word. We're looking at Matthew 17 verses 24 to 27. A saying I've used once or twice at Emmanuel recently is coming out again today, and that is that there's more than one way to skin a rabbit. Probably not something many of us have done. It's one of those little sayings to say there's more than one way to do things, and certainly it applies to teaching as well. That there's more than one way to teach effectively. Any good teacher will certainly be aware of that, and certainly Jesus, as the teacher par excellence, he knew it. Now, last week, Paul emphasized for us, as we were looking at the verses just before this, verses 22 and 23, that Jesus was repeating his teaching about his death and resurrection. He'd already made very clear predictions back in chapter 16. And here in chapter 17, he was making it clear for the second time. And actually, he's going to do it again for a third time in chapter 20. We'll come to that in a few weeks' time, no doubt. And Paul last week raised the question of why. Why was Jesus repeating himself? Well, he was doing so as a good teacher. And Paul drew out for us a few of the important things that we can see from this. So he said that Jesus was repeating himself to embed the core facts, to increase their knowledge, to reassure them in the strangeness of what he was predicting, to mature their response to that teaching, and also to prepare them for the same as they look forward into the future. But actually repeating your teaching is not the only way to do it. Sometimes it helps to give subtle teaching, teaching that hints. And so I've entitled it this morning, Jesus repeats some things and hints at others, because whilst in the previous verses he was repeating himself, here he just hints at several things, and that can be a really useful teaching technique. It can be useful to give people time to get used to a certain idea, particularly if it's difficult, particularly if it's hard and complex. It can let them grasp it gradually. Sometimes it can help them just think it through for longer. It's like putting a little stone in your shoe, and you know how it is when there's a stone in your shoe, it just rubs away, and whilst it doesn't dominate, you just can't ignore it, you can't get away from it. And hinting in teaching can be good like that. Or you can think of it like giving somebody a boiled sweet, and the idea, unless you're one of those chompers, the idea with a boiled sweet is that you suck it slowly and you gradually get the flavors, the tastes, and you can taste it for a long time. Well, in the verses before us this morning, that is Jesus' approach. From the repeating of last week, we shift to the hinting this week. Now that means that as we look at what Jesus is hinting at, you could sit me down and say, it's not very clear that Jesus says that. Absolutely, that's what hinting is about. So I wouldn't like to stake my life on the things that are being hinted at here. Some of them I probably would. Some of them, well, you could say he doesn't spit it out precisely, so maybe you're wrong there. Maybe I am, but I'm trying to be faithful to a kind of natural reading of what Matthew has written in this gospel. And of course, as we remember Matthew is writing in this gospel, we remember that he is doing so led and inspired and driven by the Holy Spirit. He's not just a mere human being writing alone, but God is working through him. So we're trying to listen honestly to what Matthew is conveying through Jesus' teaching. And yes, there's hints. And I think Jesus wants us to listen to these and to dwell on them and to think them through for our own lives and grasp what they might mean for us. So the first thing we're going to see is that Jesus hints that he knows everything. He knows everything. You see, a conversation takes place, as is introduced for us in verse 24. A conversation takes place outside the house where Jesus is staying. It's in Capernaum. It's probably Peter's house. We don't know that for sure. But he lived there. He came from that area, so it's quite likely it's Peter's house. Jesus is staying there, and a conversation takes place just outside the house between Peter and these tax collectors. Now, these tax collectors weren't kind of local government officials. They were collecting taxes for the temple back in Jerusalem. That was a good number of miles away. And so they were kind of doing their rounds. And they have this conversation, this conversation. Now, this tax has its roots back in the book of Exodus, where in chapter 30, the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give half a shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs. This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. So that's the background. It's become an annual tax, it seems, by now. When it was instituted, it seems to be a one-off lifetime payment, but there's inflation for you down through the centuries. People have made it into an annual tax. And the question is posed to Peter in verse 24, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Peter is very clear in his answer. Comes straight back to them. He says, yes, he does. Now, whether he knew that for sure, or whether he was perhaps a little bit embarrassed in the situation and thought best way to avoid trouble is to say yes and then check with Jesus later, it's perhaps a little bit difficult to know. And then Peter goes inside. That's how we know that the conversation took place outside the house and Jesus was inside the house. Because in verse 25, it says, when Peter came into the house, Jesus was the first to speak. And he says to Peter, what do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? See what's happening there? Jesus doesn't wait to be informed by Peter of the question that was asked of him outside the house. Jesus knows already. Now, you could say maybe Jesus was hanging around by the window and overheard through the window. I'm not sure that fits with a natural reading of this, particularly when you think back in chapter 9 and verse 4. We read, knowing their thoughts, Jesus said, why do you entertain evil thoughts in your hearts? Jesus is a man who knows our thoughts, never mind our words. Back in chapter 9, he knew what people were thinking, even though they weren't saying it. So I think in the flow of Matthew's gospel, here's a hint that Jesus knows everything. Later on in this gospel, chapter 26, we'll see that Jesus also knew and predicted that all his disciples would leave him come the time of his arrest, and that actually the apostle Peter, who's very much in this story, would deny knowing him 3 times. So Jesus knows everything. So I think we're to read not of Jesus overhearing through the window, or of somebody running in first to give him the news before Peter comes in. But I think we're to see here that Jesus is hinting to Peter at the time and to us today that he knows absolutely everything. He doesn't need a word from Peter explaining what is going on. He knows. Jesus knows everything. John in his gospel clears this up for us very, very clearly. In John chapter 2, verses 24 and 25, 2 statements are made of Jesus where it says, for he knew all people, and that he knew what was in each person. That's John making it very clear in his gospel. But here, it's more of a hint not 100% clear. You're left wondering, is that really how he knew? But I think then when you conclude, yes, he knew. He really knew what was going on outside. You're left wondering, well, who is he? Who is this man who knows everything? Who knows everything apart from God? Exactly. That's the point. That's kind of another layer of Jesus hinting here. If he's the one who knows everything, who is he apart from God? He is God. He is God. The Son, that's part of the hint as well. But then there's a challenge here, isn't there? To think if Jesus knows everything about you and me, that means that you and I can't hide anything from God. You know, there's nothing hidden at the back of the wardrobe. There's nothing hidden in your Google search history. There's nothing that supposedly happens in Vegas and stays in Vegas that really stays in Vegas. Jesus knows everything that you want to be kept a secret. So challenge him. He knows all those details about you and about me. But then the flip side of this same coin of the fact that he really does know everything is, oh, how encouraging that is. Yes, he knows and understands. He really does. He knows and understands everything about you and me, the challenges we're facing, the realities of life that other people just don't grasp, the questions that are going through our heads, the deep issues of our hearts, the things we don't understand ourselves, about ourselves. He knows. He knows everything. But then secondly, Jesus hints that he is the Son of God. You see, rather than give a quick, easy answer to the question of, doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax? Jesus actually poses another question to Peter. He says, what do you think, Simon? Verse 25. What do you think? From whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes? From their own children or from others? Well, throughout the vast majority of the history of the world, kings and queens don't tend to charge their own family, the princes and princesses of their kingdom. They don't charge them income tax, poll tax, whatever tax. Kings and queens tax their subjects, not their children. There may have been some modernisation in the UK. The Queen is said to pay income tax, but in the sense she voluntarily offers that. She isn't obligated to do that. But anyway, there's been some modernisation. But there's the question Jesus poses. You know, who do kings tax? Their own children or their subjects, others? Well, the answer comes very quickly from Peter. From others, he says. And Jesus then responds to that by saying, then the children are exempt. Now why does Jesus do this? Why doesn't he just jump to the end of the story? Why doesn't he just send Peter off to get this fish to pay the tax? That would have been a shortcut to all this conversation going on with Peter. Well, I believe it's because Jesus wants to teach something else. He hints at something else. He doesn't quite spell it out, but he hints at something else. I have to stand back a bit from this to understand it properly. Remember, the temple, this is called the 2 drachma, the double drachma temple tax. The temple was built, as we see in Exodus 25, as the dwelling place of God, not literally, but a representation of this is the special place where God is to dwell. It's kind of his house. So when we think about the temple tax is the tax for God's house. So in what Jesus is saying to Peter, the question is like, well, who does God tax? His children or others? That's the question. But then think back that the original question by the tax collectors outside to Peter was not, Peter, do you pay the temple tax? But does your leader, your teacher, pay the temple tax? The question was about Jesus. And this answer is about Jesus too. When Jesus says, then the children are exempt from this tax, he literally says, because he uses a masculine word, he literally says sons. It's the same word that he uses in this passage when he talks about the Son of Man. It's that word, but in the plural. Now think about this. Jesus is saying the sons, the Son, is exempt from this tax. The question had been, does your teacher pay? Does Jesus pay? And Jesus says, look, if you really want to know, I don't have to pay. Because I'm the Son, the Son of God. That's what he's getting at. Now suck on this sweet truth. Suck on it slowly. Meditate on it. Think it through. That Jesus is no mere man. He's the Son of God. He's God the Son. He's man, yes, absolutely, 100% man. And yet he's God at the same time, 100% God. He's the Son of Man, but he's the Son of God. He's human and he's divine, which is actually, going back to the previous point, which is why he knows everything. He knows everything because he is the Son of God and can do anything. Jesus didn't need to pay because he is the Son. Now, thirdly, we see that Jesus hints at the fact that he had surrendered everything. So having said that basically he's exempt from the tax because he's the Son of God, he then says to Peter, but so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Now, why not just dig in your pocket and pay? Why have this thing where a fish is taken and in the mouth of this fish, a coin is found to pay? Was it just for the shock factor, the miracle factor to get people thinking that way? Well, God doesn't work like that. He certainly does want people to be amazed by the miracles he performs. But actually, the pattern in the Bible is this, that God only does incredible miracles when they are needed. So, for instance, one example, and if you want to follow the pattern, you've got to read through the whole Bible, but set the pattern like this. One example from the Bible is, for 40 years, God's Old Testament people were wandering around in the desert, and for every day, God miraculously supplied what was called manna. Special food descended every night, and in the morning, this food could be collected from the ground. And for 40 years of wandering, they had that food. But God was taking them through to the promised land, and as soon as they'd arrived there, the manna stopped. You can read that in Joshua chapter 5 for yourself. As soon as they were settled, they could grow food, they could harvest it like anybody else. But 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, in the desert, they really needed this miracle, so God did it for them. So I don't think Jesus is just kind of putting on an amazing firework display of a miracle here to get people thinking. So why did he do it? Some say he had no ready cash. Well, that's basically all people had in those days. Banks didn't really exist, so I don't think that's the answer to it. I think there's a suggestion here, a hint, that he had nothing with which to pay. Now, let me be honest, we're not talking about a few pennies. This double drachma tax that has got to be paid is quite a sum of money. A drachma was basically a day's wage for a labourer. I don't know what you want to count that as today, because labourers are paid at different rates, but let's say £100. Well, a double drachma, £200. So it's not like just a few pence, but it is quite a sum of money. But then think of the fact that here is Jesus, the Son of God, God the Son, the creator of the universe, therefore the owner of everything. The Bible says of God the creator that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and yet here he is. He can't pay the bill. Why? Because in coming to this world, Jesus had surrendered everything. Isn't that amazing that Jesus, for us, will give away everything to enter this world? Now that's a hint. That's a hint of how much more would he give to save the world. That leads us on very nicely to our fourth point, that also Jesus hints that he will pay for others. You see, in the conversation that had taken place, there was no question about Peter pay. The question of the tax collectors was, does your teacher pay the temple tax? Maybe they knew that Peter had already paid. Maybe they were like so many other people trying to find fault with Jesus as the leader, and so they're only questioning about Jesus. Hard to know. But they certainly weren't asking about Peter paying. They weren't bothered about him. And yet, when Jesus speaks in verse 27, he says, but so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake, throw out your line, take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours. Twice the value needed for Jesus. The coin was twice as much as was required, so that Jesus could pay for Peter as well. That's incredible. He didn't need to, but isn't there a hint here? Doesn't this remind you of what Jesus came to do? What did he come to do? Well, on the very first page of this gospel, we read at a time of prediction of Jesus' birth that Mary would give birth to a son, and you're to give him the name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. He would pay for others. That's what he came to do. He came to save people from their sins. Now that fits exactly as well with the purpose of the tax. The tax is called the temple tax, which might, just if you listen to that briefly, you may think it's like a tax for the upkeep of the temple. But go back to what we read in Exodus 30, and we read these words, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time that he is counted. A ransom, a payment. And this payment of the temple tax was in view of the fact that there's something wrong with us, wrong in our relationship with God, and payment needs to be made to rescue us, to save us. And here is Jesus paying the temple tax, not just for himself, as the tax collectors were questioning about, but for others as well, for Peter as well. He was going to pay the temple tax. But in the bigger situation of Jesus coming into the world to pay, to save his people from their sins, how would he do that? Well, for clarity, for the detail, we have to jump forward to chapter 20, where in this series in Matthew's Gospel, we will soon be reading that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for others. Not a coin, not 4 drachma, 2 drachma, or how many drachma. He actually was going to give himself. His life was going to be given in order to save. But here in chapter 17, he's just hinting. It's like, in the morning, if you've got heavy curtains and it's really dark in your room, but the sun's shining outside, it's as though Jesus is just opening the curtain a little, to let in a little of the light. And that sometimes, if you've got a bedroom where the sun really does shine on in the morning, that's a good thing, because it kind of blinds you if you open it quickly. But here Jesus is just letting in a little light to prepare his disciples, to prepare you and me for the fact that he's going to do more than pay with a coin for us. He's going to pay with the giving, the surrendering of his own life. You see, this payment here of the tax gives a fuller, glorious picture of Jesus dying on the cross for the sins of others. So when you go back to the last 2 verses that we focused on last Sunday morning, Jesus made clear by repeating in those verses what he was going to do. Here in these verses, he is hinting at why he was going to do it. He was going to pay for others by his death on the cross, paying so that we can be forgiven, so that we can have a relationship with God, so that we can be adopted into his family, so that we can have everlasting life. And that's what Jesus went on to do. He paid with his life. Now, will you trust him as having paid for you, for your sin? That is what these hints leave us asking.